Okay, alright. Anyways, like I said, I have delayed this as long as I possibly can. So today we're going to be looking at the different scenes that we directed throughout this semester. So, unfortunately, like I said, 3 out of the 4 directors that we're going to be talking about today are not here. So they will be able to watch it on the YouTube channel.
They're not going to watch it.
They're going to watch it, Lincoln.
Why are you putting this on YouTube?
Because I like the opportunity. Oh my gosh!
If you're watching this,
You're a nerd.
I like.
look in the Disney Channel.
Okay.
Wait,
Great.
I have to finish it.
Stop. No.
Thank you.
It's dead.
I like the idea of being able to go back if y'all want to, if y'all don't remember a certain aspect of something, and being able to review it. So it's just there for people's consumption after the fact. Because maybe sometimes there's pop quizzes like right now.
Oh, pop quiz?
Yeah.
I'm great at these. Sure.
What was Rear Window about?
Okay.
We talked about.
I got it.
You can just speak.
Okay, Rear Window was about a guy inside.
I don't want the plot.
Okay.
I want what Alfred Hitchcock was trying to communicate with his film. Rear Window.
How people looking into people's lives, just a small little window looking into people's lives, and catching just these small little glimpses and making these giant assumptions.
I like
based
that.
on those small
For sure.
things.
A lot of talking a lot about judgment. About we not only look at people and maybe judge them too quickly, but also judge people for
the things they do.
judge people for the things that they do that we shouldn't probably necessarily do. What was The Third Man about?
The Third Man. Ooh, it's about an astronaut, right?
That's the first man. I'm talking about the third man.
Okay, Boomer.
movie was about
Was it?
30 years old.
It was about the death of art, the emptiness of art.
No.
No.
In a way,
I wasn't paying
Vienna
attention.
sadly has been destroyed and is about, the corruption of things that are beautiful in the world. But what was The Third Man about? We definitely watched this movie and talked about this movie for an hour. So. Oh my god.
The Third Man.
Oh my goodness
I looked
gracious.
up Deffer.
Oh, wait a minute. Was it about? It was something to do with art.
Holly and Harry.
Yeah.
Orson Welles is the bad guy
Harrison
who
Wells.
we thought was dead but was not dead. Holly is his friend searching for him.
Oh, that's
okay.
what you were looking for.
What does the film say
Set in post
through
word,
their
Vienna, Australia.
hey
It's Austria.
Jonathan? What was Carol Reed trying to say with the third man? What is the reason that the movie exists?
Come on, leak it.
I'm totally blanking on this movie.
Yeah, me too.
I can
It
tell
was
you.
definitely my least favorite movie of the movies we watched. This
Was I here
semester.
for this?
You're breaking my heart.
Well, it's just
You're
Of
going
the
to a
movies
place
you
that I
made
cannot
on this
follow.
was like-
of the movies that
We
we
didn't
watched
watch it,
this
Lincoln.
semester. It was my least favorite.
Okay. The Third Man is about Carol Reed tries to discuss broadly that every person has good tendencies and bad tendencies, a bad side of themselves and a good side of themselves, and we will always choose what is evil in the world simply because it's more interesting to us. We find it more appealing than what's good. Good is boring and bad is interesting.
Unless you have Jesus.
And so sadly, unless you have Jesus, and so sadly, the world is in a vicious cycle of constantly choosing evil, and evil corrupts and destroys the world, just as World War II corrupted and destroyed what was beautiful about Vienna. So, The Third Man definitely had a strong theme and message. Rear Window definitely had a strong theme and message. What was Sunset Boulevard's strong theme and message?
Of art, of writing, how it was talking about more of a. It was more directed at Hollywood.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
how we prioritize what is empty and meaningless over what is full and meaningful.
Beautiful. I mean, very well said. Yes.
I had a question. You said World War II. Wasn't the third man shot in like 1930 something?
No,
What was it?
1953 maybe,
53? Man,
52.
why did I have it thinking it was? Oh,
Yeah.
it's set in like. Well, no, it wouldn't be set in 1939.
Yeah, it's set right after the war.
Which would have been like in the late 40s. Okay, I'm sorry. I
Okay.
don't know why I had the date wrong.
I'm texting a girl.
'Cause I was
Yeah, I'm not
confused.
afraid to kick you out of this class, Jonathan.
You are expelled.
Shape what was Sunset Boulevard about? Isaac, you answered that very deftly. Who saw Citizen Kane? Because definitely not a lot of
I
people.
watched it on
Was
my
that-
Luke did. You, I don't think you were here. What was Citizen Kane about?
I have my opinion.
Go ahead.
Lead.
It was about a guy who's like growing in riches. Like he was taken from a simple life and he was pushed into this big industrial world, and he grew up and was successful, but he felt empty, and he was trying to drag people down with him, like his wife, and he kept on trying to drag. But then at the end we hear Rosebud, and it was that little sled, the simple life that he longed for that he could never get. That's what.
Okay, well, you did it. Yes, that's correct. That's a lot of what Orson Welles is trying to discuss with Citizen Kane.
That was his first movie. Huh?
It was his very first movie he made whenever he was 23 years old, younger than I am, and just only a little bit older than you are
makeup
now.
was really good too.
The makeup was really good. Orson Welles is probably one of the most notorious critically acclaimed films of all time. It is not a film that I am a big fan of.
Really?
Citizen Kane is not Orson
Citizen
Welles.
Kane?
They go together.
You didn't like
You're not
Citizen
wrong.
I'm not a big fan of Citizen Kane. I can appreciate it technically, but I don't resonate a lot with its message because, one, it's confusing and difficult for me to figure out. There's a weird transition where he's taken and then we see him as an adult, and I'm not really sure what happened. Why is this kid being taken away from his family? And what is the life that he's being pushed into?
They said
Why?
because they're poor.
You're poor.
And so they are selling their son into slavery?
No, because the guy. Yeah, you're right. I can't think of the
Not even
reasons.
exactly slavery.
They're selling their son to a corporation,
Yeah.
which is slavery.
The school.
Well,
Like
And then the son,
And that was the thing that
being
used to happen.
thus sold into the corporation, now is super rich.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he went to be like, I guess, tutored by this businessman, and
And-
this businessman brought him up in his own home and made
So he's being adopted.
basically
Mm-hmm.
Because it
because by
doesn't.
somebody who can take care of him, unlike
Okay.
his parents.
Anyways, my point is
Yeah.
there's some gray stuff in there that's a little confusing and difficult to follow. I feel like.
But maybe
and
it
then-
wasn't at the time.
Maybe it wasn't at the time, and that's true. But then ultimately, in the end, what is the film's ending note?
They're like, you can't find like the speak.
You know,
You can tell your
That's
yeah.
my joke.
Copyright, like
TM.
the big
All right.
successful life that he was living was not like
Did that need so much build up?
the need for
Yeah.
him to.
Did that need so much build up? And what about the reveal? How was the reveal executed?
Do what?
The reveal of what Rosebud means
Mm-hmm.
feels gimmicky. Why? Does it need to be this twist?
Well,
Oh, what a twist! And
well, like,
okay,
it was like I saw it as more of like, cause like well, first of all, during the last 30 minutes when we saw him as an old man and retired, basically,
Mhm.
we saw that need a lot. Him constantly trying to, like, living in this big, like, almost this very conspicuously empty house,
Hmm.
and him.
if you could call it a house.
Yeah, well, this conspicuously vacant mansion, and because like all the furniture was like
Yeah.
far apart.
Yeah.
His wife was sitting over there while he was over there. It just kind of resembles the distance between him and everybody else.
Absolutely.
And I think it was more of a character-based film than
But of all the good things that Citizen Kane says, and I'm not saying that it doesn't say good things, of all the good things that Citizen Kane says, does it say anything better or more deep than any other film throughout history? Is it technically better and more dramatically impactful than Rear Window, The Third Man, or
I would not say.
Sunset Boulevard?
I would not say
no,
so.
it's not to me.
But it was a good movie.
It was a good movie, and I'm not trying to say it's a bad movie.
At the time,
I'm just trying to say it's not necessarily the movie that. It's not even not the movie that people say it is. In my opinion, I don't see much value in something that people call valuable. And so my point with all that is, you as filmmakers are going to find value in things that people don't find valuable, and not find value in things that people do find valuable. You shouldn't let that sway your opinion.
Mhm.
If you have good reasons for having your opinion, if you're able to back up your opinion with a solid argument that's founded on logic and scripture, then you're entitled to that opinion. You're not entitled to an opinion just because it's yours. That's not what I'm trying to say. You're entitled to an opinion that you can defend adequately.
yeah.
And so that's why what film does is encourages conversation and opinions. And my opinion of all of your films is going to be dramatically different, probably, from what you intended. And so don't let my opinion sway what you think about what you created if you don't agree with the reasons why I'm providing that opinion. Do you see what I'm saying? My point is, don't be intimidated by me or by anybody else into thinking something that you don't really believe just because everybody else believes it.
That kind of reminds me of like, for the past, seeing how the new Star Wars is coming out, for the past 3 days, me and my brother have had the same little debate, if you can call it that, of
Yeah.
The Last Jedi.
Yeah.
Of him. Like,
It's a
we
controversial
constantly-
film.
Yeah, we kept
Yes.
on going at each other's throats.
No.
And then, like, I just realized that we've said the exact same thing to one another 3 days in a row for
Yeah.
30 minutes
Right.
every day.
Right.
Mhm.
And, like, it just hangs.
And-
the opinions, that's what.
For sure, and y'all are entitled to your opinions that you're able to defend logically and scripturally. And at some point, you just have to agree to disagree because film makes people, creates conversations and creates opinions. So, anyways, I just wanted to preface that and use Citizen Kane as an example to help you all understand what this is geared to do. This is a critical analysis of each one of the scenes that you, Isaac, and you, Robbie and Mason, they're there. Robbie and
they're
Mason
dead.
Yeah, I
and
see them.
You're not even gonna think
and,
about watching
Lucas.
I see nothing.
they
There's
are.
no one there.
There's gonna be no cues.
Anyways, don't let my opinion change your opinion unless you find valid reason behind what I'm saying. So behind all critical analysis is made up of two forms, both subjective analysis and objective analysis. Subjective analysis is what I got out of the film that's not necessarily intended by the artist to themselves. I get a lot of theological ideas out of the films of Damien Chazelle. Damien Chazelle is not a Christian. And so that analysis of his films is my subjective analysis that I can back up with argument and reasons and evidence. But it's a subjective opinion. The other half of critical analysis is objective analysis, looking at the piece and trying to see what the artists themselves intended to say, so that you're reading the piece the way that the artist intended for it to be read. So you will hear a blend of my subjective analysis of your films and my objective analysis of your composition and shot choice. So, without further ado, we will start with Calvary Film, Fall 2019. We'll start with Mason's film, his scene from Rear Window. We're going to watch how Mason did it, and then we're going to watch how Alfred Hitchcock did it. So, prepare yourselves.
There's one view on the Hey, it's you, Robbie.
So, you didn't see the killing or the body. How do you even know there was a murder?
Because everything this guy's done has been suspicious. The late night trips in the rain, the knives, the saws, the trunks full of rope, and now his own wife is missing.
I admit it does have a mysterious sound to it, but it could be any number of things. Murder the least plausible.
Now don't tell me he's just some street magician trying to amuse the neighborhood with his sleight of hand tricks. Don't tell me that.
It's way too obvious. Quite frankly, a stupid way to commit a murder. I mean, he's got a view of, 50 windows? And then he's just gonna sit there, smoking a cigar, waiting for us to come pick him up.
Then go do your duty, pick him up.
Jeff, you got a lot to learn about homicide. I mean, morons that commit a murder so well, it's taken 100 trained policemen to go catch them. That salesman wouldn't just knock off his wife, toss her to a trunk, and put her in storage. Doesn't make any sense.
I'm sure it's been done.
I mean, everything's been done. In panic. This is that 1,000-1 chance that guy is still sitting there in his apartment. He's not panicking.
You don't believe me, do you?
I mean, I think you saw something. I just think there's a logical explanation.
For instance,
She took a trip.
she's been sick in bed.
So you told me. I mean, not that it hasn't been fun, Jeff, but I gotta run along. And I'm not gonna tell the department. Just let me poke around on my own, see what I can find. No use in getting any ridiculous publicity or anything like that.
Thanks.
Are you struggling with any headaches lately?
You know what? Not until you showed up.
Well, I'm sure it'll wear off along with your hallucinations. See ya.
Alright, that's Mason's version of his scene from Rear Window. Let's look at Alfred Hitchcock's version.
Oh, this version's close.
Didn't see the killing or the body.
The last one was
How do
better.
you know there was murder?
Because everything
There's
that's
a whole
was done has been
bag.
suspicious. Trips at night in the rain, and knives and saws and trunks with rope, and now this wife that isn't there anymore.
I admit it all has a mysterious sound. Be any number of things.
Kind of looks like
Murder's the least possible.
Don't tell me he's an unemployed magician amusing the neighborhood with his sleight of hand. Now, don't tell me
there's the same
Too
music
obvious
by
and
Pop.
stupid way.
No, that's my city.
A few windows. And sit over there smoking a cigar waiting for the police to come pick him up.
that. Officer, don't shut the door and pick him up.
Jeff, you've got a lot to learn about homicide. Why morons have committed murder so shrewdly it's taken 100 trained police minds to catch them.
Isaac's cuter there.
That salesman wouldn't just knock his wife off after dinner and toss her in the trunk and put her in storage.
Oh, but it's been done.
Most everything's been done. Under panic. This is 1,000 to 1 shot. He's still sitting around the apartment. That man's not panicked.
You think I made all this up?
Oh, I think you saw something. There's probably a very simple explanation.
For instance,
Wife took a trip.
his wife was sick in bed.
Yeah, that's what he told me. Well, Jeff, I've got to run along. I won't report this as an apartment. Let me poke into it a little on my own. No sense in you getting a lot of ridiculous publicity.
Thank you.
We know the wife is gone, so I'll see if I can find out where.
Do that.
You, had any headaches lately?
Not until you showed up.
It'll wear off, along with hallucinations. See you around.
Okay. So, immediate, no, things that you see comparing the two.
That's such a random scene. Why'd you pick that one? Did you not? Or did somebody-
It's relatively shootable. It has only 2 characters in it, and it all takes place inside one location. So,
I would say one of the main differences goes along the lines of the performances, which would mean that Hitchcock's is much better.
okay.
I
We are.
noticed, after a lot of digging and lots of digging, below the surface kind of stuff, outside the box,
Which is
Right.
what digging is.
I noticed that these actors in this scene,
Are
compared
paid.
to the other ones, are much older.
Wow. What does that say for the
That's
greater
right.
context of the narrative?
Okay, boomers.
I would also say that the tone.
No,
Okay,
that's-
that's a really good observation.
Something
Yes.
I noticed is that
They had a
Because, like,
better budget.
The other tone, like the Mason's version, the tone is a lot more serious.
Yeah,
And
for
then
sure.
this one is a little bit more,
Yeah.
kind of like
True.
a mild concern. The other one is like as though,
The world depended upon it.
yeah. This one is just like
Yeah.
kind of like the detective's curious, but versus Mason's was like the murder had happened and they saw it.
On Mason's thing, it looked like some kind of detective show. That just looks like a Full House type show.
Okay, yeah. Softer, kind
There's-
of.
It seems like there's a little more familiarity between these two guys in this scene
Hmm.
because of how they're going back and forth with each other.
Okay, very
Yeah.
cool. So, Mason's scene, Mason directed in 4 shots. And he directed it in less shots than Alfred Hitchcock, who did it in 6 shots. But if you look at it, it really isn't that big of a difference. The main difference is Alfred Hitchcock has this coverage here, not this coverage here, this one shot here, and then he has a second shot for Jimmy Stewart other than this one. But Alfred Hitchcock uses this coverage because the guy is leaning out the window. And if you look at this shot, if he's leaning out the window, whenever he's looking at the detective, he's almost looking completely away from camera. So, out of necessity for the blocking, Alfred Hitchcock sets up one that's closer to his eye line here, and then sets up a separate one for that. And then sets up a single medium shot on Jimmy Stewart to match the coverage of this guy's shot. What's the main difference that you see in coverage style?
These wider.
No, well, probably.
The
This one's almost the same.
Could you have
Mason's.
You know.
Yeah.
Here, let me just do this.
Oh, I also see like not just in the tone of the performances, but also the lighting is very
One's warm and one's cool, for sure.
yeah.
That goes into another part of how that's like a murder show.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
It's a bit more dramatically lit. Yeah.
It's got almost that blue light effect that you see in every Christopher Nolan movie.
Yeah. Interestingly, one of the main similarities is the coverage of the detective is like exactly the same as the coverage of Isaac. Like Isaac even walks like the same direction, like walks from left to right, and his coverage even pans with him from left to right. It's interesting. I thought that was weird for Mason, having never seen Rear Window before he directed, to set up almost identical shots. But yeah, Mason directed the scene in 4 shots, and he's following all the good rules. He has a master, which accomplishes all the jobs that a master wants to accomplish. It establishes geography, and it conveys... It establishes geography, and it conveys the majority of the relevant action. So it does what a master does. And Mason has coverage, which does what coverage is supposed to do. It conveys performances important to the narrative, and it obeys the 180-degree rule. Isaac is looking from left to right, and Robbie is looking from right to left. Therefore, it looks like the 2 characters are looking at each other. whenever you match the coverage up. So I think probably Mason's most interesting shot is this one. It was very, very smart to have this panning coverage because essentially out of this one angle, Mason gets 3 different shots at 3 different points, depending on where Isaac's position is in the blocking. The composition works really well on both the front of the shot and the end of the shot. We see that Mason is following the rules of thirds really well. But what would you say the one thing is that's off? Whenever we're just looking at the thirds.
Well, the negative thing.
Nope. The headroom, exactly. It's a little bit too high. And so Isaac's face is a little bit lower than we probably want it to be. Lower than that intersection. But that's justified and makes still for good composition because of the symmetry that this sign creates. Because there's roughly the same amount of space in the frame on the bottom and the top of the sign. Our brain justifies, the sign has interesting subtext about the character itself.
What does that song say?
Hey, ladies, you can't put your trust in a man unless he can first put his trust in God.
I'm a bad man.
Yeah, it makes you sound really bad. But the sign works.
Just add an arrow from the side.
Yeah. The sign works. The composition works because the sign is there, adding symmetry. Our brains will forgive the relatively high headroom because we're creating symmetry with our
It looks
composition.
like an
Man, I
advertisement.
fricked up. I can't believe I lost her.
Oh yeah. The first thing that we look at is Isaac's face. Why?
Because it's a face.
Because it's a face and
It's lit.
And
it's
on.
lit. It is, if not the brightest thing in frame, it's in the brightest area of the frame. And so because it's bright and because it's a face, we look at it immediately. What's the second thing we look at?
The
The
sign.
ladies.
Why?
Because it has words that we
Because
want
it has words.
And
Words.
it has-
up a big piece of the frame.
His massive-
It does take up a large piece of the frame, you're correct. But it's text, and text always draws our attention. However, what would you say you look at first?
the face.
The face, because it's a face, and a face is going to hold more compositional weight than text, depending on the size. A face is going to hold more compositional weight, and because it's brighter. So what works really nicely, Mason has an implied guiding line here, because we can see a little bit of detail on this wall, and we can see more detail in the front than we can in the back. So the audience assumes this wall is moving into the frame, even though we don't have any real guiding lines. But I would say that's not really what creates depth in this image. It's the fact that Isaac is just a little bit backlit, and so it separates him from the plane of the background. What was I saying before?
For what?
I was making a point. I left.
You said you talked
Talking
about
about
it
Star
in
Wars.
line.
Oh, that's right.
This-
And so because we feel a little bit of depth in this image because of the wall and because of his separation, our eye first looks at Isaac and then at the text, but it doesn't just pan from left to right. Guiding lines and subjects within your frame play like gravitational fields inside your image. And so our eye is drawn first to Isaac and drawn deeper into the image by the guiding lines, and then moves from left to right across the frame to see the sign. And so what Mason is doing really smartly here is he's moving the audience's eye through the image in the order that he wants them to move. He's dictating where the audience looks and when, which is the definition of composing an image well. So, very, very well composed image. The reason why this has depth, creating depth in an image, is all about establishing planes of depth within the image. Isaac is on one plane, the text is on another plane. The reason why we feel the distance between those planes is because of contrast and separation. The contrast that we see here, Isaac's shirt is both more saturated in color and is brighter than the wall behind it. So we feel the separation there. That's why you backlight your characters to separate them from the background and add more dimensional planes in your image. So it's relatively flatly composed, but there's still depth. You can compose flatly, but you cannot, if you want to create a good image, create an image without depth. Another director who's very famous for flatter compositions is Wes Anderson. This is a relatively flatly composed image, but there's still a lot of depth to it. The guiding lines.
What's the Wes Anderson?
This is Wes Anderson. This is from. This is from Grand Budapest Hotel. It's relatively flatly composed, but it has depth in the image because of these guiding lines created by the detail on the wall pulls our eye into the image. And the contrast, the color contrast between the red lady and the purple jacket people creates a plane here and then a plane in the background where he is. So there's depth, even though it's relatively flatly composed. You can compose something flatly, but you cannot create an image without depth. Or at least you really shouldn't create an image without depth. So it works on the front. It maybe loses it a little bit in the middle, but then it really works on the end. At the end, we create even more depth because we have more guiding lines, which draw our eye into the image. But what is not in this one that was in the other one?
The light. The backlight. No, we have that.
No, not necessarily. But what's missing inside this image that we need to create depth? Planes.
Yeah.
What are the planes inside this image? Where are they?
I'm blanking.
The only plane that I see is the one that Isaac is on. He's pretty much in the same plane as the wall, but that's the only plane. And planes are the key to creating depth. If he had like a couple of chairs in the foreground here that like made like a plane, then that would add more depth to the image by adding foreground into the image, creating further dimensional planes. However, we really feel the depth of this image whenever it's moving because Isaac is moving through the image. He's moving back and forth throughout the scene in the depth of the image that we've created. So you really feel the weight of this deeply composed image because Isaac is physically exploring that depth throughout the scene. So, not only is the shot really nice compositionally, it says something really nice dramatically. Robbie is roughly the same size in all of his shots. What happens to Isaac in all of his shots?
Change size.
He gets further and further away from us as the scene progresses, and more importantly, as we start to realize he's not going to help us. And so because we relate to Robbie's character, and Robbie stays roughly the same size, we feel like that's, our position. This is supposed to be Robbie's perspective. And so we feel like this is our position as the audience in this scene. And Isaac, who is our source of help, who's here to help us alleviate the tension and the conflict, is moving further and further away from us until ultimately he leaves the scene entirely. And we understand he's not going to help us. So the shot not only is well composed, but it meaningly adds to the dramatic narrative in what it says subtextually. So yeah, great job, Mason. Next, we have The Third Man, directed by Lucas Mason, not to be confused with Mason Humphreys. Yeah, so The Third Man. This is the scene.
This is the last scene I cover my eyes for.
This is Lucas's scene.
Oh no, he was quite dead. I don't know, that just sounds crazy. I mean, if he was killed at once, how could he have talked about me after he was dead? Why didn't you say this all at the inquest?
It's better not to get mixed up with things like this.
Things like what?
I wasn't the only one to give evidence.
I like how green.
I don't know. I like
3 men helped carry your friend across the street to the statue.
Kurtz?
Yes.
Romanian?
Yes.
And...
There was a third man. He didn't give any evidence.
You mean the doctor?
No. No, he came later. After they carried him to the Joseph statue.
What did he look like?
I didn't see his face. He looked. He didn't look up. He looked ordinary. He could have been just anyone. Just anyone, huh?
Justin.
Is it that dude?
You're asking the right question. So yes, that's Lucas's scene.
See,
Now
I could
let's
watch that
see.
one. I could actually watch it because it was like I like the color.
Now let's see how Carol Reed would have done it.
He was quite dead. But this sounds crazy.
I remember
If he
this
was
movie.
killed at once, how could he have talked about me and this lady here after he was dead? Why didn't you say all this at the inquest?
It's better not to be mixed up in things like this.
Things like what?
I was not the only one who did not give evidence.
Who else?
3 men helped to carry your friend to the statue.
Kurtz?
Yes?
The Romanian?
Yes.
And
There was a third man. He didn't give evidence.
you mean the doctor?
No. He came later. After they carried him to the Joseph statue.
What did this man look like?
I didn't see his face. He didn't look up. He was quite gewöhnlich, ordinary. He might have been just anybody.
Just anybody.
So right off the bat, comparisons that you.
Black and white. There's
They
no
still-
broom.
I mean,
Still had that same like looking out the window and seeing.
yeah,
They
exactly,
had
which
that
is
same
very
dog.
cool. Again, bear in mind that y'all nobody saw these scenes, these movies before they directed the scene. So it's interesting that y'all both see Lucas and Carol Reed both see these interesting things in these scripts that they were presented with, and directed it in kind of similar ways by having that moment there. What's another observation? Intentional director choice observations.
The
Dutch shot.
I would say
The Dutch, yeah.
I would say that Lucas's those last 2 shots were very wide,
Okay.
and I'm just kind of like
We're in the coverage a lot for this. We play a lot of it
yeah.
in those 2 shots of Holly and
Most of Lucas's scene was
was real wide. Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Lucas's scene is composed of 4 shots. Carol Reed's scene is composed of 9. However, we're not going to count 2 and 3 here because they don't really contribute. They're not really for this scene. They're for the greater movie in itself. But they don't really go with the scene that we're talking about here. But Carol Reed has a master and coverage, and is following all the rules and establishes the geography really well here. Why does Carol Reed have this second master? What's the difference between the 2?
it's closer
Yeah. Why?
because
What just happened in between them?
we another like more information.
Yeah, we left the scene and we're looking at something different.
Yeah.
So Carol Reed gives us a master, establishes that this is happening, cuts to I can't remember her name. A something. Whatever.
Alice?
Cuts to her for a while, and then comes back, but he comes back closer because he draws the audience in more to this conversation. We're going to put the emphasis on this conversation now. So Carol Reed also has like an extra shot because he's got these 2 extra shots in there. So I would say Carol Reed probably has something like 6 shots compared to Lucas's 4 shots. So. But yeah, the main differences that we can see is there's way more coverage in this one. If only for these 2 and these 2, what would you say is the coverage in Lucas's scene?
Was very viewer dependent.
Okay, that's not what coverage is.
Well, I'm just saying. Like,
Coverage is specific.
Well, I'm
This
saying
is
it's-
coverage. This is not. This is viewer dependent. The viewer can choose to look wherever they want to. The director's job is to guide the viewer's eye into the image, the exact same way that Mason did earlier, and Calvary does that really well in this one.
I thought you were asking why, like.
I would say that Lucas doesn't have any coverage in his scene. He's got these wide two shots, but never really gives us a solid master that conveys most of the action that happens in this scene, and never really gives us any solid coverage, which allows us to cut in and choose what lines to emphasize in the scene. So the audience is very dependent upon fighting for themselves, looking and seeing what they choose to see in the frame instead of what the director is choosing to show them. And that's fine. That can be Lucas's choice. I would say it makes the narrative a little staler. We're not being told anything. Whenever we see this man's reaction to the lines that Holly is saying, we're getting new information. We're not specifically told we're not specifically seeing Robbie's reaction to what Isaac is saying, and therefore the only time we really get new information is if we're looking at it ourselves and we can see it in Robbie's little face in the relatively wide frame. So, I would say Mason probably wanted coverage. If I was going to do something differently in Mason's scene, I would have added coverage and
Mason's scene or Lucas's scene?
Lucas. Lucas's last name is Mason. So I know I get confused. That's why I was misspeaking. But in Lucas's scene, I would have added more coverage, and I also would have changed something about this shot. What do we think about the composition of this shot?
Like too close, cut off, like
They're off.
Yeah, they're definitely really far apart. The audience will forgive if you're too close together. But being on the edges of frame like this puts a lot of negative space in between these characters. You can choose to make that a thing. Like, let's say Robbie was all the way on this side and Isaac was like right in the middle. Then Isaac is like pressing Robbie up against the edge of the frame, and so it gives us like tension. You can use that to your advantage, but in this circumstance, I don't think Lucas is doing that. And the characters are kind of far apart. And kind of don't have a whole lot of headroom. And the reason why they don't have a lot of headroom is because we were struggling to get a microphone over their heads. And so you want to take into consideration things like that. You need to, as a director, Isaac, you said whenever you're directing your scene, you rarely even looked at the camera. And so if you're not looking at the images that are being created, then you're not doing your job as the director, because what I would have done in his situation is said, let's just shoot somewhere else. I can't compose something here and capture good audio. But I would change something else about this shot. Not just the fact that they probably should be close together. What's very nice about this shot is it has some really strong guiding lines. We feel there's a lot of depth here. There is the plane that the characters are on, and then I would argue that there's a plane here where this wall ends, and then there's a separate plane where this wall is.
And also there's a lot of backlight.
And there's a lot of backlight. Both these characters are very well separated from their background. Maybe not Robbie so much on this side, but they're relatively well separated from the background. There is a lot of depth in this image. How would we have added more depth?
some foreground or something.
How are we going to do that with the tracking shot?
Interesting.
How would we have added more
Get out
depth?
closer to the wall.
Yeah, that definitely would have helped, for sure. I would have not moved it. What does the movement in this scene
Exploring,
add to this scene?
exploration, like the characters are exploring.
Well, they're not. And see, that's the thing. The camera tracks with these characters, and so they stay in the same relative position within the frame. They're not exploring the depth of the composition that's being created. And so if we had locked the camera down, and they had started real small in the background and had walked all the way into the foreground, then we really would have felt the depth that's being created in this image. That's why, for these tracking shots, why I was reluctant to even allow you to use the moving tripod, because movement is a crutch. It's why I don't like movement in films, because you need to have a good express reason for having movement in your film. Why does Lucas move this shot? I think probably because he wants to stay at the same distance away from the characters. But it decreases the depth of his composition and makes it just a lot more technically difficult. The reason why movement looks so cinematic is because we're constantly seeing a new image. This image is changing because we're moving through space, and therefore new information is being revealed. The image is changing, but also because cheap productions don't have the ability to move their camera very easily, and so whenever a camera is moving in a scene, that makes it seem expensive, as if this is a big budget movie that's creating what's being shown here. So movement is cinematic, quote unquote, but often is used as a crutch, because if I just move my image, now it's cinematic and I don't have to pay attention to the composition. It just looks good because I'm moving the camera. So therefore, next semester, if you're going to want the tripod, you're going to have to provide me with a reason why you want it, and I'm going to have to concur with that reason. So prepare yourselves for that. Yeah, I would have let them stay all the way in the background and walk into the foreground into like a close-up in the foreground. It makes it, I mean, Lucas might have good reasons. He's not here to defend his actions. Anyways, I would say the best composed image is this one in the entire thing. This one is very, very cool. The super wide angle gives us a lot of, allows us to see a lot of space around him. Centralizing him in the frame allows us to emphasizes really specifically what he's thinking in this moment without being super close to him. So it's a great way to emphasize a specific character without having to cut into like a close-up to be in like a relative medium and still see the environment around them. But there's a lot of great guiding lines. Even just this little snippet here, because we can see the reflections in the window, we feel this wall and it draws us into the image. And our eyes move through the image. We
also
are
have
here.
The parking lot lines a little bit.
Oh yeah, absolutely, for sure. Robbie is on the frontmost plane, and then we have this wall, and then we even have further the trees, and so there's a ton of depth and dimension in this image, and it's just composed really well. It says interestingly dramatic things as well. This idea of even like the silhouette of the window on the wall feels almost prison-like, like bars on a window. So you feel this sense of him trapped behind it, looking out into a world that he cannot affect or understand. It's interesting. It provides cool stuff. So that's Lucas's scene. And then we have Isaac's scene from Sunset Boulevard.
Is that going to be like our like intro for everything? That's kind of cool.
Yeah. Hold on, I'm not.
Why is the shop moving? Why is the shop moving?
Because I wanted to. Because I just
Well, we'll talk about
like
it.
one, two.
Well,
One, it was Lucas's decision.
We'll talk about him.
So you don't think I'm a complete swine. If there's anything from dark windows you can use, just go ahead and take it. It's yours. I mean, if there's nothing I can do for that, you can have it.
No, I wasn't.
If you want $100,000, you buy me a box of chocolate creams. If you get an Oscar, I get a wolf foot.
I'd take you up on that. I'm just not good enough to do it all by myself, you know?
What about all your ideas?
Well, see if they make sense, you know? Starting with the psychological mess, exploring the mind of a sick killer.
Psychopaths are like hotcakes.
Yeah, but this is a story about teachers and their threadbare lives and their struggles. And, you know, I see her teaching day classes while he does the night schooling. And when they first meet,
Look, if you don't mind, I don't have time to listen to the whole plot.
I can make it short.
I'm sorry, it's your baby.
We can talk about this weekend. Perhaps that gets off.
You want to discuss work with me for a game of golf.
Yeah, just talking a few friendly ideas. There's weather street also. Why? Because it could be fun, and I can work with my golf swing with the bosses. It's terrible. So, come on, let me see.
Enjoy your game of golf.
Can I take a brain check, or we can discuss it over lunch?
Alright, look, it can be done, right? Stop being chicken-hearted and interesting. Try not to be too dreary. How's this first situation? She works days, he works nights, right? Right. So they share the same room, they don't even know each other. In fact, they sleep in the same bed. In shifts, of course.
That's great. I like it. That's good.
So do I.
Well, let's see where it fits in. Come on.
I'll see you, Bridget.
Sitting in the morning sun.
There's an activity scene.
I'll be sitting when the
Isaac scene.
evening comes.
Let's see how Billy Wilder directed it.
Just so you don't think I'm a complete swine, if there's anything in Dark Windows you can use, take it, it's all yours.
Well, for heaven's sakes. Come on in, have a chair.
I mean it. It's no good to me anyway. Help yourself.
Now, why should you do that?
If you get 100,000 for it, you buy me a box of chocolate creams. If you get an Oscar, I get the left book.
You know, I'd take you up on that in a minute. I'm just not good enough to do it all by myself.
What about all those ideas you had?
Well, see if they make sense. To begin with, I think you should throw out all that psychological mess, exploring a killer's sick mind.
Psychopaths sell like hotcakes.
This is a story about teachers, their threadbare lives, their struggle. Now, I see her teaching day classes while he teaches night school. Now, the first time they meet...
Look, if you don't mind, I haven't time to listen to the whole plot.
I'll make it short.
I'm sorry. It's your baby now.
Couldn't we work in the evenings? 6 o'clock in the morning. This next month, I'm completely at your disposal. Artie's out of town.
What's Artie got to do with it?
Well, we're engaged.
Oh, well, good for you. You couldn't find a nicer guy.
That's what I think. They're on location in Arizona, making a Western. I'm free every evening and every weekend. We could work at your place if you want.
Look, Betty, it can't be done. It's out. Now stop being chicken-hearted and write that story.
Honest to goodness, I hate you.
And don't make it too dreary. How about this for a situation? She teaches daytimes, he teaches at night, right?
Right.
They don't even know each other, but they share the same room. It's cheaper that way. As a matter of fact, they sleep in the same bed. In shifts, of course.
Are you kidding? Because I think it's good.
So do I.
Well, come on back. Let me show you where it fits in.
So long.
Oh, you.
So, that's Isaac's scene. Differences that you see automatically.
Mine sucks.
That's not true in the slightest. There's some
so
actually
much negative space in my my shot choices, and plus I completely decapitated Lincoln in my third shot, and also
this one's a little weird.
my fourth shot is way too low.
I don't agree with that. I don't necessarily agree with that.
And I agree. There's no reason for that first shot to be moving. And
Yeah.
my coverage is very dull. And
Now hold on. What would you say your coverage is?
the focus, the rack focus.
It's definitely not coverage. Coverage is supposed to specifically emphasize. Coverage is supposed to emphasize specific performances that are important for the dramatic narrative. While this does emphasize each of their performances, Robbie's performance is emphasized much more than Lincoln's is.
Right.
So it's not coverage. Coverage would be a shot of each one of them, something else, something different to cut to. If anything, this is a master, and you wanted two other shots, one of Lincoln and one of... Because that way, at some point in the image, if we wanted to specifically emphasize one of Robbie's lines, we could cut to Robbie and not see Lincoln anymore. Or specifically emphasize Lincoln's line.
I had no coverage.
Take a look at Billy Wilder's coverage. What's interesting about it?
The window, in my
No.
opinion. I saw.
Oh, well, the window's great. The window adds a ton of depth to his composition. But what's interesting about his coverage?
If they're both singular.
Hey, Lincoln, wait here until Jonathan gets back for me.
They're
What?
both singing. Well, at least his second and third shot, that coverage there.
They're singles, yeah.
Yeah, and then his fourth and fifth shot
Mhm.
are like both. They like
They're
two shots.
over the shoulders.
Yeah.
And then we go back to
go
singles
back to
again.
singles again.
Interestingly, how many shots of coverage are there?
3.
No.
6.
6. 3 sets of 2. And so Billy Wilder, you can see in Billy Wilder's mind that he considers this conversation to have 3 parts. So he sets up coverage for one part, the first part, coverage for the second part, and coverage for the third part, and he wants to delineate and separate those moments for the audience, which is why he sets up separate coverage for each one. Interestingly, Isaac's scene also is delineated into 3 parts. I don't know if that's the same, but they almost line up to the same 3 parts that Billy Wilder's does. So something instinctually, you feel that there are these 3 moments and set up shots for each one of them. Billy Wilder, of course, sets up double the amount of shots because he has probably quadruple the amount of time. But yeah, each one of y'all noticed that 3 thing in there, which is interesting. But I think probably your best composed shot is this one.
Really?
Yeah. What do we see about the composition?
It's off.
No, I mean yes, a little bit, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Some nice leading lines.
But they and they're on the inside, which is relatively okay. It's okay for them to be too close together. Well, it's kind of okay for them to be too close together. It's not really okay for them to be too far apart. So I would say, yeah, you probably could have made it a little bit better by scooting Lincoln over just a little bit, to keep him on that third.
If I did, he would have died.
Yeah. But there is a pull there. But you said really well, guiding lines. We get to that in a minute. What's the first thing that we look at?
Lucas. Oh, Robbie. What's his name? There it is.
Why is Robbie the first thing that we look at?
Because he's the biggest.
Okay, and
he's in focus.
And
he's lit.
He's a face.
Yeah.
And he's lit.
Lincoln is also a face.
He is brighter than Lincoln.
I hope so.
No,
However, Lincoln is also a face. Why do we look at Robbie first?
Because he's
bigger.
bigger.
He's
in
closer.
focus and
He's
better
closer.
lit and
Closer.
takes
All-
up more
yes.
space in the frame.
All those things. So, what you do nicely is you set up a deeply composed image with. Oh yeah, when we look at Lincoln's second, you set up a deeply composed image with multiple guiding lines. We really feel the depth of the entire thing all the way back here, and this pole serves as a very strong guiding line, which pulls our eye into frame. And then your rack focusing, just like your movement in Mason's scene, moves our eye into the image and out of the image and into the image and out of the image. And so we explore visually the depth of the composition that you've created. So I think it works really well. This is probably your best composed image. And there's multiple planes set up. Robbie is very clearly separated from the other planes because of the contrast. The separation of the planes is because he's bright here and the wall behind him is dark, so he's separated there. This, however, I think is your best dramatic image. Is probably the most interesting one, and the crazy amount of headroom is kind of justified compositionally, because what did I say before? Mason gave a lot of headroom to Isaac as well. Why was that okay? Mason's shot of Isaac, his first shot in his scene. Isaac is just a little bit lower than the third. He's got a little bit too much headroom. But why was that okay?
Oh, because the picture in the background
Does what?
makes up for the
Why?
position kind of.
Why?
Symmetrical.
Because it's symmetrical. And your shot is not perfectly symmetrical, but has a bottom half and an upper half, which is separated by the guiding lines created in your frame. So, I mean, the symmetry helps justify the reason why we have so much headroom. I don't think it's a problem to have as much headroom as you have. The reason why it's interesting, though, to me, if I was going to compose it a little better, I would have moved it a little bit more to the right, and maybe even tilted it up a little bit more so that we really emphasize
that's what I wanted.
that separation. The symmetry. But the reason why this is interesting is because of what it communicates dramatically. What are the characters' positions within this frame?
Well, what I want,
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of, Robbie's bigger because I wanted to kind of exert a pass.
No. In the beginning, gotta create the head from there. No. In the beginning, both characters are on the same side of the railing. In the second shot, both characters are still on the same side of the railing. But in the third shot, whenever Robbie takes control of the situation, he crosses and moves to the other side of the railing and shuts Lincoln out. And so I like this idea that Lincoln is great at the business side of things, but Robbie is great at the artistic side of things, which Lincoln wants and Robbie knows. And so while they're on the same side for most of the scene, whenever Robbie takes the upper hand creatively and says this really cool idea about this scene, he knows that he's exerting the upper hand over Lincoln and crosses to the other side and physically blocks the space. Now, Robbie is in a separate space and Lincoln is in a separate space as well. And then even as they leave the scene, reside within their created separate spaces. And so, yeah, it's...
But with that last shot, I had things going through Robbie's face. Like the rails.
That's fine. They're not going through Robbie's face. Because of this guiding line, the audience very clearly understands that this is in a separate plane. It's creating depth in your image. It's a good thing.
Obviously.
Okay. If I was taking a photograph, that would be very good.
But if, you might not have intended that at all, but if that was something that you observed as you were thinking through the blocking in your head, you could emphasize this even more by maybe having the camera on the same side as the characters. If the camera's on this side of them in this shot, and they're on this side of them in this shot, but in this shot, we're this way looking at Robbie, and whenever he takes control, we track and look at Lincoln so that Robbie leaves. Now we've crossed this plane of the railing. Great. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Once you understand something that's interesting in your scene, you can emphasize it more by thinking through it more logically instead of instinctually.
I should have put more coverage on the stereo page.
Yeah, more coverage is great. You probably didn't have the time to do that. So I would have said simpler blocking would have been a big thing as well. And the audio is trash.
Yeah.
And that's primarily because we're inside of a staircase. That's another thing that, as the director, it's your job to consider how are we going to get audio for this scene. So.
Yeah, I didn't pay attention.
Yeah, well, it's the first time, so you're fine. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in this scene, regardless of your inexperience. So it's great. The last scene
Daddy's boy?
that we're going to be looking at is Citizen Kane.
Oh, Daddy's boy?
That Robbie directed. So.
Hey, Bernstein. Mr. Leland.
Why have that typewriter?
Where's my notice? I gotta finish my notes. Mr. Kane took it. Trying something?
Who's black and white and then he revealed.
This is just fixing that. I knew I'd never get that through. Mr. Kane is finishing it exactly how you started. He's writing that notice exactly like you wanted. I guess that'll show you.
Hello, Jedediah.
Hey, Charlie. Didn't know we were speaking.
Sure, we're speaking, Jedediah. You're fine. That reaction is actually not your reaction. The reaction but I cut into your reaction to me saying sure. But I wanted that moment to last longer. So yeah, that's Robbie's version of his scene from Citizen Kane.
3 shots.
4 shots. 4 shots, yeah.
5.
Yeah, 5 shots actually.
Alright.
I was
Yeah.
right.
Let's look at Orson Welles' version.
Harrison Wells.
Not 6. Not 6.
Is that alcohol?
Where's
Is
the
that
alcohol?
drinking?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
alcohol.
No drugs?
You should have had drugs. Oh, he's smoking a tobacco.
Well, Bernstein.
He's smoking. You're such a
Hello.
savage.
Hello. Where's my notice, Bernstein? I've got to finish my notice.
Mr. Kane is finishing it for you.
Charlie?
Charlie? Charlie, out there.
I guess he's fixing it up. I knew I'd never get that through.
Mr. Kane is finishing your review just the way you started. He's writing a bad notice, like you wanted it to be. I guess that'll show you.
Hello, Jedediah. Hello, Charlie. I didn't know we were speaking. Sure, we're speaking, Jedediah. You're fired.
So yeah. Ooh.
Careful, Blaine.
Yeah.
You're impeaching on my gimmick.
Immediate observation. What? Yeah, this is very dark.
Okay.
Immediate observations, differences that you see.
Lighting.
I didn't get.
Okay. What about the lighting?
This one's a lot more ominous. I would say,
Okay.
like a little bit more dreary. A little.
Okay.
The other one.
Darker, more dramatic.
Yeah.
Okay. Other differences? I think they probably have different moods. The actual Citizen Kane one feels sadder for some reason, probably because of the low state that Jedediah is in that scene. But one of the interesting comparisons is this is the first scene of this semester so far that the original scene actually has less shots than the scene that we shot. This is why I assigned this scene to Robbie, is because if we wanted to, we could have created this whole scene, recreated this entire scene, shot for shot. We could have done that in a time and space that we were allotted. So that would have been interesting. There are some.
You need a cigar and alcohol too.
Well, we wouldn't have had those things, but there are some notable differences. However, what are they? Actually, what's probably the most significant similarity?
The
Probably
lighting's
this-
pretty dramatic.
Yeah, similarity. I guess that's
Well,
pretty similar.
both of them,
Yeah,
right?
that's true. That's true. You're right.
I would say your performance. Well, you've seen the movie. Never mind.
Yeah.
The whole shot of between Jedediah, between Lincoln and you was like I felt was similar. Like the tone was similar.
Okay.
to-
Sure. The drama has been built up the same amount.
Mhm.
What's interesting is there's no coverage in either one. As we've looked at each scene, y'all all use these relatively wide master shots, but don't have any coverage. This is the first one where Robbie also used relatively wide master shots. This is kind of coveragey. It's pretty wide coverage though. Doesn't have a lot of coverage. That the original scene also does not have a lot of coverage. It uses these kind of wide mastery 2 shots. So I thought that was interesting. But there are some compositional things. What about this one? Compositionally speaking.
A little too much headroom.
A little too much headroom, probably. Yeah.
I mean, like, they're on thirds, but
They are on thirds, which is nice.
again, yeah, their faces are a little off. But
Lincoln is pretty overexposed as well. Being a face and the brightest thing in frame draws us to him immediately. And what we see there, whenever we're drawn there, is this kind of nasty, overexposed, gross
And
stuff.
there's a lot.
So that kind of diminishes the quality in our mind.
There's some negatives. There's a lot of negative space.
I mean, up high, sure. But if we just tilted down, there wouldn't have been that much negative space. That would have been okay. I would say tilting down would have definitely helped us as well, because that would have established this guiding line a lot more. We would have seen, maybe if we tilted down far enough, we might have even seen like the whole other edge of the table there. So that would have really drawn us. It would have added more depth to tilt down too. So I think that was definitely a missed opportunity. Lincoln is the person that we looked at first. This does establish a guiding line though, which guides our eye into the frame.
I do like
to
what he did
Robbie.
with the lighting. Like, he was
I
laying
do
out,
like what he
and
did
then
with the lighting.
he lifted up, and then that's when Robbie's there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. This is another one where really cool image, really fantastic lighting. I really like that the reflections on the glasses really draw your eye to his eyes, but keep his eyes hidden from you. And so you don't connect with him as much. He's enigmatic. There's less empathy there because you can't clearly see his eyes. However, the framing is a little weird. I am centered in frame, and that would be okay if this frame was clean. One, it would be okay if it was tilted down more and my eyes were on a third. But if this frame was clean, then it'd be really okay. However, it's not. Lincoln crosses and then lands here. And so Lincoln is just like this little sliver on the edge of frame. And because Lincoln is a person, he holds compositional weight, to the audience, and therefore it makes this feel really unbalanced. Now there's like nothing in this whole other half, and everything's on this half for some reason. So I don't know. It's just interesting composition. And again, just like with your movement, and just like with Lucas's movement, why do we track with this?
Yeah.
There's not a lot of reason to. It doesn't add anything to the image, and just makes the shot more technically difficult to accomplish. So, however, one of the best shots is this one. Mm-hmm. I wish that that Lincoln is lit properly in the second position, but this is a really nice shot. It accomplishes a good deal of depth because we feel the door and the window on one plane, and then I'm on the back plane. Also, something bright is in the background. That always is going to draw our eye deeper into the frame. But what's more important about it, we talked about exploring the depth of the composition. Whenever Lincoln comes in, and I'm very centered in frame, so immediately I'm the first thing that you look at, and I'm subconsciously created as the most important thing to look at in this frame. Then whenever Lincoln walks into the frame, if you can see that at all, Lincoln's eyes are almost exactly on this third. Lincoln's eyes are on this third.
I can see it.
And so therefore, this close-up is composed well as well, if it was lit properly. So the shot changes from one well-composed shot to another, while at the same time emphasizing the depth of the composition. So very, very well-composed shot, works very, very nicely. Yeah. One of the shots that I liked the most, and I wish we could have used more, in fact, What I might have done differently was made Lincoln sit in a chair here, and then never left this composition of me, like never even seen my face or whatever, because we saw my face in the coverage, and so we know I'm there. But this makes me feel like this big, imposing force, and if you're seated there real small, that makes you small compared to me.
Yeah,
And
nice.
so that would have been interesting. I do like how big this makes me feel in comparison to you. But then whenever you go from the door and come into the frame, we're equalized again. Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah.
You
Okay.
Are you done with this?
Yes.
Okay.
Be a hand model.
I have the way I rewrote the
Yeah.
Boulevard thing. I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
How did I do?
Fine. Yeah. The new angle is interesting. The new competitive angle is interesting. But let's talk about that a little bit later because I am running out of time, and we need to talk about. This was Calvary Film Fall 2019. We need to talk about Calvary Film Spring 2020.
Yes.
Yes.
I say we don't do a youth group episode.
I definitely have it all planned out already, so you have no say.
Darn. So we are doing a youth group episode.
Not necessarily. Maybe, not necessarily. Calvary Film Spring 2020 will begin on January 26th. So you have the rest of this month and almost the entirety of January to have off.
Oh, so we're not doing anything between semesters?
We can do something in between semesters. It will be entirely voluntary, though.
Oh, wow.
So if we're going to shoot a new episode of the youth group, we would do that in between January 1st and January 26th.
Interesting.
We can talk about that more on Wednesday. I'll be up here. And on Wednesday we can discuss that more, plan things out, and we can shoot for 2 or 3 weeks in a row at this Calvary Film time.
And we can make it really good.
From 4 to 6. Yeah, absolutely.
Spend a lot of time on it.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. We'll have,
You gotta put our heads together.
between now and then, we'll have something like 4 weeks.
So what about my idea about the person who...
That's what we're coming to. Calvary Film, Spring 2020. We will not watch any more movies. We will not have any more lectures. We will, for the entire semester, be creating original content.